You were trained to be desirable, not to be free. That's where her story begins, not in rebellion, but in obedience. For years, she mistook control for safety and affection for freedom. Every time she tried to leave a cage, she built another, with softer walls. Ones that smelled like comfort, sounded like understanding, and looked suspiciously like love. Because freedom, true freedom, is a quiet terror. And pain, when familiar, feels like home. She wanted to escape the gravity of her own patterns, but desire has a strange orbit. It pulls you back to what you haven't healed, to the echo that shaped your first definition of love. You think you're chasing passion, but you're only circling memory. He was her reminder, not of romance, but of repetition. Every word he said carried the resonance of someone she once needed to impress. Every silence carried the judgment of someone she once feared to disappoint. And so, she called it attraction. But it was recognition, her shadow remembering itself through the shape of another. He didn't imprison her. He didn't have to. Her mind did that long before he arrived. The paradox is ancient. The woman who calls herself independent, yet still dances to the rhythm of her unhealed longing. The woman who says, I want freedom, but still chooses what validates her old pain because it feels known, because it feels earned. In Jungian language, she was possessed by her animus shadow, the archetype of the woman who confuses love with being chosen. She didn't want to be free, she wanted to be understood, to be seen, without needing to explain the ache. But that longing came at a cost. Freedom demands separation. Pain promises belonging. And so she chose the latter. When she looked at him, she saw not a man, but a mirror, a doorway into her own unconscious. Every time he withheld affection, her inner child flinched. Every time he returned, the child smiled. This wasn't romance, it was reenactment. A ritual disguised as love. Psychologically, this is called repetition compulsion. The magnetic pull to recreate the emotional conditions of childhood in the hope of mastering them as adults. But mastery rarely comes through repetition. It comes through rupture. And she wasn't ready to rupture yet. So she stayed. She stayed because familiarity feels like truth when you've mistaken pain for identity. Because she thought healing would mean losing the intensity, the fire, the drama, the ache that made her feel alive. But freedom isn't always a flame. Sometimes it's the quiet refusal to burn. When people say she wanted freedom, they often imagine flight. But psychologically, freedom begins not in movement, but in awareness. In the moment, you realize the door was never locked, only guarded by your fear of what exists beyond it. Still, she hesitated, because beyond the door was silence. And silence was unbearable for a woman who was once rewarded for noise, for pleasing, performing, proving. She wore independence like a mask. But underneath, her nervous system still bowed to approval. Every decision was a negotiation between the woman she was becoming and the girl who still needed to be liked. That's the cruel irony of awakening. The body remembers what the mind denies. She could quote self-worth in daylight, but still chase pain in the dark. Because freedom doesn't come from declaring, I'm done. It comes from enduring the emptiness that follows that declaration. In myth, this is Persephone's descent, the woman who leaves the surface to meet her own shadow in the underworld. The story is not about captivity. It's about initiation. Because before a woman becomes sovereign, she must first meet the version of herself that still kneels. And that's where she was at the edge of awakening, one hand on the door, one foot in the familiar, torn between the echo of pain and the possibility of peace. She didn't choose the man. She chose the memory he represented. The comfort of the known is seductive, even when it hurts. Especially when it hurts. Because if you've survived pain long enough, it becomes proof of existence. And without it, who are you? The woman who wanted freedom was still learning what it meant to be free. Not freedom from men, not freedom from love, but freedom from the self who believed pain was the price of connection. Every relationship before had been a mirror, the same reflection, wearing a different face. Until she understood that mirrors don't lie. They just wait for you to stop running. That's where her revelation began, not in a scream, but in stillness, not in another man's arms, but in the realization that desire without awareness is just another form of captivity. She no longer wanted to be saved. She wanted to understand why she kept building cages out of comfort. Because every woman who craves freedom must first confront the part of her that finds safety in chains. She lived in the illusion that choice meant freedom, but choice without consciousness is only repetition disguised as liberation. In Jungian psychology, this is the shadow's favorite trick to make captivity look like independence, to whisper, "You're different now," while quietly replaying the same emotional choreography beneath the surface. The woman who wanted freedom did not yet understand that her shadow was fluent in seduction. It knew exactly how to dress pain in the language of empowerment. It knew how to make her believe that staying in the familiar was strength, that endurance was love, and self-abandonment was loyalty. So she stayed in the theater of her own psyche, acting out the same scene with different characters. Each relationship became a ritual not of connection, but of confirmation. The mind is a pattern-seeking creature. It will return to what it knows, even when it hurts, because the unknown feels like death. And yet, beneath that fear was something older, an archetype as ancient as Eve, and as modern as every woman who's ever said, "I'm fine," when she was quietly disappearing. The Jungians call it the anima captiva, the imprisoned feminine psyche, who mistakes the bars of her own longing for destiny. She wears many names: the muse, the caretaker, the savior. She appears soft, nurturing, endlessly forgiving. But beneath that softness lies the unspoken rage of a woman who has forgotten her own hunger. She wanted to be chosen, yes, but more than that, she wanted to belong. And belonging, to her, had always been bought with self-erasure. The roots of this pattern stretch back to childhood, where love was conditional and silence was rewarded, where she learned that compliance meant safety and distance meant rejection. So, when she met a man who mirrored that emotional landscape, her nervous system called it chemistry. That's how trauma disguises itself as passion. That's how the body remembers. When he withdrew, she didn't chase him because she needed him. She chased him because she needed resolution. But the unconscious doesn't seek resolution through logic. It seeks repetition until awareness intervenes. And awareness had not yet arrived. So the dance continued, a psychological tango between her wounded feminine and his detached masculine. Each saw the other not as they were, but as a projection of their own unfinished story. He saw a woman to complete him. She saw a man to release her. Both mistook reflection for reality. The descent is never glamorous. It begins quietly when she stops defending her pain and starts observing it. When she realizes that her desire for freedom and her attachment to pain are not opposites, but twin threads woven through the same tapestry. She started to notice the small betrayals, how she said yes when her body said no, how she forgave too quickly, how she mistook anxiety for excitement. Each realization was a fracture. Each fracture, a doorway. This was not punishment. It was initiation. The soul dismantles illusion gently at first through whispers, coincidences, dreams, then louder through heartbreak, exhaustion, silence. She began dreaming of mirrors. In every reflection, her face changed. Sometimes she was the child. Sometimes the mother. Sometimes the stranger she had become to herself. The mirror was not judging her. It was inviting her to see that every man she loved had been a messenger of her own unconscious. The one who ignored her showed her how she ignored herself. The one who controlled her revealed where she feared her own power. The one who adored her taught her that she still didn't know how to receive. Each reflection was a teacher. Each heartbreak, a translation of something her mind couldn't yet articulate. This is the truth modern psychology and ancient myth agree upon. The descent is the feminine initiation, the dark night of the psyche, where every false self is stripped away. In mythic language, it is Inanna's journey through the underworld. The goddess of heaven descends to meet her sister, Ereshkigal, the goddess of shadow. At each gate, she removes a layer, her crown, her jewels, her garments, until she stands naked before the dark twin of herself. That's where the woman found herself too stripped of titles, partners, affirmations, and dreams of rescue. Nothing left but her own silence staring back. The descent is cruel only to those who resist it. But she was beginning to understand freedom isn't found in the light. It is born in the dark, in the willingness to face the self that still believes love must hurt to be real. Her longing became her lantern, her sorrow, her compass. She no longer feared the shadow. She began to speak its language. And in that moment, something shifted. For the first time, she didn't rush to fix, to prove, to please. She simply watched the pain move through her and didn't follow it. It was not healing yet, but it was awareness. And awareness is the first crack in the spell. The breaking point did not come with shouting, nor with betrayal. It came in the quiet, in the unbearable stillness of a night, when she realized that no one was coming to rescue her from the pattern, not even herself, at least not the self she had always been. That self was built to survive, not to awaken, and survival has no use for truth. It only understands repetition. She sat in the dim light of her apartment, surrounded by the faint echo of his absence. The silence between them had grown into a presence of its own, vast, heavy, and mercilessly honest. It was no longer about him. It was about what his absence illuminated. The mirror had turned into a storm. Every memory became a trigger. Every word he'd spoken replayed, as if her psyche were dissecting it, for meaning, for closure, for anything that would make sense of the ache. But logic cannot heal what emotion keeps alive. And so, she began to argue with herself, two voices, inhabiting the same consciousness. One said, "You deserve better." "Okay," the other whispered. "But at least he made you feel something." This is the war within the feminine unconscious, the battle between awareness and addiction, between the soul's longing for peace and the ego's craving for intensity. The shadow confrontation is not a single moment. It's an unfolding, a psychological crucifixion of identity. Jung called it enantiodromia, when a force, pushed too far in one direction, turns into its opposite. The woman who sought love became the woman consumed by it. The one who said, "I want freedom," found herself enslaved by the memory of her own longing. She tried to distract herself with rituals of control, deleting messages, blocking numbers, crafting affirmations she didn't yet believe. But the psyche doesn't respond to commands. It responds to presence. And presence requires facing the unbearable, the truth that she wasn't addicted to him. She was addicted to the version of herself that existed in his gaze. He had been the stage. She had been the performance. Now, the audience was gone, and the silence, after applause, felt like death. For the first time, she allowed the grief to move through her without interpretation. No labeling it as healing, no romanticizing it as growth. Just raw, unfiltered sensation. The tremor in her hands, the tightness in her chest, the cold realization that she had confused emotional chaos for aliveness. This was the death of illusion, and death, in psychological terms, is transformation wearing its darkest cloak. The storm inside her became a ceremony. Each tear was not weakness, but water washing away an identity she no longer needed. Each silence was not emptiness, but space being cleared for truth. As she sat with the ache, a memory surfaced: her younger self, standing by the window as her parents argued, learning without words that love was something you earned by staying quiet. That was the blueprint. That was the beginning. And the man, he was never the problem. He was the pattern incarnate, the living symbol of her earliest wound. Now came the confrontation, not with him, but with projection itself, the psychic force that turns memory into destiny. She began to see how her desire had always been shaped by scarcity. How attraction, for her, had been less about connection and more about familiarity. Her body longed for what her mind claimed to hate: distance, unpredictability, the cold promise of almost. Oh, in that paradox, she recognized the true face of her shadow, a woman who did not yet believe she could be loved without earning it. And so she created dramas that allowed her to work for love, to chase what should have been freely given, because to receive easily felt foreign, and the foreign felt unsafe. The psyche is brilliant in its cruelty. It will choose the known hell over the unknown heaven every time. Then, something subtle shifted. The inner dialogue softened. The war quieted. She began to sense that what she had called freedom was only rebellion against dependence, and rebellion, too, is a form of attachment. True freedom, she realized, was not the absence of pain, but the absence of compulsion. That night, she didn't text him, not out of pride, but out of peace. Not to prove anything, but because the urge itself had dissolved. It was the smallest act of sovereignty, invisible, but seismic. Her nervous system, once addicted to the adrenaline of longing, began to feel something she hadn't known in years. Stillness. And stillness, at first, felt terrifying. Then holy. Because when the storm ends, you don't miss the thunder. You notice the air it left behind. She wasn't healed, but she was no longer hypnotized. And that difference, that gap between reaction and awareness, was her first real breath of freedom. The descent had broken her open. The confrontation had burned her clean. Now, what remained was integration, the slow, sacred rebuilding of self from the ashes of old desire. She was no longer asking, "Why did he do this to me?" She was asking, "Why did I keep doing this to myself?" That question, quiet, honest, unflinching, was the beginning of transformation. Freedom does not arrive as fireworks. It enters like dawn slowly, without announcement, illuminating everything that once felt unreachable. For the first time, she wasn't chasing a feeling. She was observing it. Desire had lost its fever, not because she had numbed it, but because she had finally understood its language. Desire was never about the other. It was about the parts of herself still waiting to be met. She began to see how every attraction had been a mirror, every heartbreak a message. Her pain had never been punishment. It was a teacher. And teachers disappear when the lesson is learned. The lesson was simple. Freedom is not escape. It is ownership. Days passed in quiet rhythm. The urgency was gone, replaced by awareness. She noticed how her breath deepened when she stopped apologizing for her boundaries. How her body relaxed when she said no, without guilt. How peace felt less like boredom and more like truth. It was strange at first, this serenity that didn't depend on anyone's presence or attention. The woman who once measured her worth through reaction now found meaning in stillness. She was learning to exist without performing, to love without losing, to feel without collapsing. The psyche had rebalanced itself, the animus and anima, no longer at war, but conversing. The masculine within her, the logic, the clarity, the protector, had stopped punishing her softness. The feminine within her, the intuition, the empathy, the flame, had stopped confusing chaos for passion. Balance was no longer an idea. It was embodied intelligence. She returned to her old places, the cafe where they met, the street where they argued, the park where she once waited for his text. They looked different now, as if the world had exhaled. The ghosts of her past were still there, but they no longer held authority. The mirror had become transparent. The reflection had become her own. There was no bitterness, only understanding. He had played his role perfectly, as all mirrors do. He had shown her the wound, not to wound her further, but to guide her back to it so that she could finally close it herself. In that realization, forgiveness became natural. Not forgiveness as permission, but forgiveness as freedom, the release of energy tied to an old illusion. She no longer needed to win, or be right, or be remembered. The woman who once defined herself through reaction now defined herself through presence. Freedom, she discovered, is not the opposite of love. It is the condition for real love to exist. Because love without sovereignty becomes survival. And survival knows nothing of intimacy, only transaction. She saw it clearly now. Every time she had sought validation, she was outsourcing self-worth. Every time she had tried to control, she was masking fear. Every time she had romanticized pain, she was avoiding stillness. Now, she understood what the silence had always tried to tell her, that love begins where dependency ends. She had not lost anything. She had retrieved herself. Weeks later, she dreamt again of mirrors. But this time, she did not see multiple faces. Only one, her own calm, awake, untamed. The woman in the reflection did not smile, nor did she weep. She simply existed radiant in her neutrality. Behind her eyes, the ocean was still. The storm had served its purpose. She woke with a soft certainty. Freedom was not about walking away from others. It was about no longer walking away from herself. In myth, every descent ends with return. Persephone rises, inanna ascens. But they do not return the same. She too had emerged different, less dramatic, more whole. No longer the woman who needed to be chosen, but the woman who chooses. No longer the echo of old wounds, but the voice of her own becoming. And in that quiet morning light, she understood what all her pain had been preparing her for. To feel without fear. To love without losing herself. To stand alone without loneliness. This was not victory. It was sovereignty.